The summer of 1942 was unlike any other in the Pacific theater. The jungles of the Solomon Islands were alive with tension, the air thick with humidity and the scent of salt from the surrounding seas. The clash of empires had brought thousands of soldiers to this remote, unforgiving stretch of land, each side determined to claim dominance. Amid the chaos, a peculiar story unfolded, one that would be whispered among soldiers for decades. A story that began not with fire or blood, but with a simple piece of metal. On one side of the battlefield, Japanese officers meticulously inspected their troops. They were disciplined, precise, and ruthless, the embodiment of a military culture that demanded perfection. They moved through the lines with a cold, clinical eye, noting every uniform crease, every polished boot, every weapon meticulously maintained. And then they came upon something they couldn't understand. Their eyes fell on a group of American soldiers wearing helmets unlike anything they had seen before. To them, the helmets were almost laughable, awkward in shape, bulky, and strangely utilitarian. In their experience, a soldier's protection was measured by pride and tradition, not by strange, untested metal domes. Laughter echoed through the Japanese lines. "Those men wear hats?" one officer reportedly sneered. "Do they think this will save them from bullets?" The soldiers beneath the helmets felt the ridicule, their faces tense, aware of the mockery from the enemy but confident in their own preparation. They had trained for this, prepared for the worst, and trusted the tools provided to them. The helmet, designed by American engineers who had studied countless battlefield reports, was more than a piece of gear. It was a shield, forged not for glory, but for survival. Back in the United States, these helmets were seen as standard issue, almost mundane in appearance. No one could predict that this simple innovation would become a lifeline. The design was straightforward, a steel shell, slightly domed, with a simple liner inside to cushion the impact of shrapnel and debris. It was heavy enough to protect, light enough to be worn for hours, and robust enough to withstand the unpredictable horrors of war. Engineers had spent months refining the curvature, the thickness, and the suspension system, testing it against both blunt force and the piercing bite of metal fragments. They had understood one crucial truth. In modern warfare, survival could hinge on the smallest advantage. Across the ocean, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, the irony of the moment was unfolding. Japanese officers mocked the helmets, dismissing them as childish or inefficient, entirely unaware that the soldiers beneath them were about to face the full fury of artillery, machine guns, and falling trees. Every laugh, every smirk, every roll of the eyes would soon be drowned by the chaos of battle. And yet, at that moment, time seemed almost frozen. Soldiers moved through the dense foliage, their senses sharpened by training, their hearts pounding in anticipation. Sweat dripped down their faces, soaking into the fabric of their uniforms, while insects buzzed incessantly in the oppressive heat. Among the Americans, there was no laughter, no doubt, no question. Every man understood the stakes. The helmet was more than metal. It was a symbol of preparation, of trust in one another, of the belief that a single decision choosing to wear it could determine life or death. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the jungle floor, the first distant sounds of gunfire began to echo. The war had arrived, and with it, a test that no engineer, no officer, and no soldier could have fully anticipated. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that even in the smallest details, ingenuity could alter the course of events. Every soldier wearing that helmet carried a silent testament to countless hours of thought, experimentation, and human perseverance. The Japanese officers, still laughing in disbelief, had no idea that their assumptions about human vulnerability were about to be shattered. In the end, what seemed trivial, almost comical, would become the difference between catastrophe and salvation. As the morning haze lifted, the stage was set. The battalion moved cautiously through narrow paths, avoiding snipers and ambushes. The jungle seemed alive, every leaf a potential threat, every shadow a possible danger. And then the first artillery rounds screamed overhead, exploding in the dense canopy. Metal and splinters flew in every direction, striking anything in their path. It was here, in this maelstrom of chaos, that the helmet would prove its worth. A soldier ducked instinctively as a shell fragment tore through the branches above. Others fell to the ground, dazed or injured by falling debris. And yet, time and again, the men with the helmets emerged with only minor scrapes, their heads shielded from the deadly shrapnel. What had seemed laughable to the enemy now became a silent, undeniable proof of survival. Each saved life added weight to a truth that would soon resonate far beyond the jungle. Preparation, innovation, and courage could defy even the most dismissive contempt. The story of the helmet is often told as a footnote in history, a minor anecdote amidst the sweeping narratives of war. Yet, for those who were there, who saw the difference it made firsthand, it became a legend. It was a reminder that war is not only fought with courage and strategy, but also with foresight, ingenuity, and respect for the smallest advantages. The moment of laughter, the scoff of disbelief, it would echo for decades, but never with the same confidence. The helmet had spoken, silently but unmistakably, in the universal language of survival. And so, as the jungle settled into a tense, uneasy silence, after the first clash, the soldiers adjusted their helmets, wiped the sweat from their brows, and continued onward. Every step was a testament to the ingenuity that had saved them. The Japanese officers, watching from a distance, were forced to reconsider what they had mocked, to confront a truth they could not ignore. Sometimes, survival comes not from tradition, pride, or bravado, but from the smallest, simplest acts of preparation. The jungle seemed endless, a labyrinth of green and shadow, concealing dangers that lurked in every corner. The American battalion moved forward, their steps cautious but deliberate, each man relying on training, instinct, and the silent reassurance of their helmets. The Japanese forces were everywhere, hidden in trees, dug into trenches, and waiting along narrow ridges. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves could signal an ambush. The tension was suffocating, yet there was an unspoken confidence among the Americans. They trusted the tools they carried, and the helmets, now more than ever, had earned that trust. The first wave of Japanese assault came with a sudden, terrifying intensity. Bullets ripped through the foliage, and artillery rounds shook the ground beneath their feet. Men ducked, dived, and scrambled for cover, their hearts hammering in their chests. And then it happened, one of the first moments that would define the legend of the helmet. A soldier, barely 20 years old, felt a sharp impact on the crown of his head. Pain shot through him, but as he steadied himself, he realized he was alive. A jagged piece of metal had struck his helmet, denting it severely, but leaving him unharmed. His comrades froze for a heartbeat, staring at the helmet in disbelief. What they had once taken for granted, this strange, unassuming dome of steel, had just absorbed a blow that would have otherwise been fatal. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the day, fragments of shrapnel, splinters from exploding artillery, and falling branches struck men again and again. Each time, the helmet took the impact, bearing the brunt of destruction so that the soldiers beneath could survive. One young private later recalled the sensation of feeling the force of an explosion crush against the metal above his head, while the sound of ripping steel rang in his ears. Yet, when he stood, blinking through the smoke and heat, he was alive. Others were not so lucky. Those without helmets, or whose helmets had been removed for a moment, suffered injuries that could have been prevented. The Japanese officers, who had once laughed at the sight of these ridiculous hats, were forced to rethink everything they thought they knew. Reports from the battlefield trickled back to their command, stories of Americans surviving blasts that would have ended lives almost instantly. The officers were meticulous in recording these anomalies, but the truth was obvious. The helmet was changing the equation. It was not a weapon, it was not a strategic maneuver, but it was protecting lives in a way that no training could replicate. What made this helmet so effective was not simply the steel used, nor the weight or the shape alone. It was the combination of all these elements, the curvature that deflected fragments, the liner that absorbed shock, and the suspension system that kept the metal from resting directly on the skull. Engineers had spent countless hours perfecting each detail. Every millimeter of thickness, every angle, every strap placement had been designed with battlefield realities in mind. It was a triumph of foresight and simple engineering, a reminder that innovation does not always come in the form of weapons or machines. Sometimes, survival depends on the smallest, most overlooked protections. As the battle raged on, the Americans pressed forward through the chaotic undergrowth. Each step was a test of nerves and endurance. The heat was relentless, the air heavy with smoke, the cries of wounded soldiers cutting through the canopy. And yet, the battalion pressed on, undeterred. Leaders counted heads, checked their men, and were astonished at the number of soldiers who had emerged virtually unscathed despite taking direct hits from shrapnel that tore through everything else around them. It became clear that the helmet was not merely a piece of equipment, it was a silent protector, a guardian that allowed the battalion to fight longer, maneuver smarter, and survive against staggering odds. The stories began to accumulate, almost like folklore. There was the lieutenant, who ducked just as a mortar round exploded inches away, the fragment striking the top of his helmet with a ringing clang, leaving a visible dent but no injury. There was the machine gunner who, while crawling across open ground, felt a sharp impact on the back of his head. He froze, thinking the end had come, only to see the metal of his helmet crumpled in the exact place where a bullet would have pierced his skull. In every unit, similar stories emerged, an almost supernatural consistency that transformed the helmet from a simple piece of gear into a symbol of life itself. Historians later examined photographs of the battlefield, black and white images that captured men in the dense jungle, their helmets scarred and battered, yet firmly in place. Each dent told a story, a moment where the line between life and death was drawn. Soldiers themselves would talk about the helmet with reverence, describing it as a silent companion that never faltered, never complained, and never abandoned them. Letters sent home to families sometimes included sketches of the dents and cracks, small souvenirs of survival, tiny pieces of proof that the war was not won by luck alone, but by preparation and design. Interestingly, the helmet's design influenced tactics in subtle ways. Soldiers became more confident in their movements, willing to advance under fire, take calculated risks, and maintain positions that might have otherwise been untenable. The psychological effect was profound. It was not only shielding heads, it was shielding courage. When men believe they are protected, their effectiveness multiplies, and a battalion that could have been scattered or decimated held firm, coordinated, and resilient. In this way, the helmet shaped the outcome of engagements far beyond its immediate physical protection. The Japanese, increasingly aware of this unexpected advantage, began to adjust their strategy. Snipers aimed at bodies, targeting legs and arms rather than heads. Artillery and explosives were concentrated on terrain rather than individual soldiers. Even so, the American soldiers moved with a calculated calm, using the jungle to their advantage, leveraging both skill and the subtle power of their protective gear. By the end of the engagement, the battalion had survived with casualties far lower than anticipated, a testament to a helmet that, at first glance, seemed laughable, almost trivial. As the sun began to dip behind the thick canopy, casting long shadows across the battlefield, a realization began to settle among the men. This was not merely survival by chance. The helmet had earned its reputation, not through ceremony or pride, but through consistent, undeniable proof. Every dent, every scar, every near miss reinforced a truth that could not be ignored. The smallest innovations, the simplest acts of foresight, could determine life or death. The soldiers adjusted their helmets one last time for the day, sweat-soaked and battle-weary, and moved to regroup. In letters, diaries, and reports, the events of that day would be recounted for years. Historians would later describe it as a pivotal moment, where human ingenuity combined with courage and discipline altered the course of a skirmish, and arguably the lives of an entire battalion. The helmet, once the subject of ridicule, had become legendary, not because it was flashy or powerful, but because it had fulfilled the most essential promise of warfare: to protect, to endure, and to save lives when everything else failed. The final hours of the battle arrived like a storm, heavy and unrelenting. The jungle, already soaked with sweat, smoke, and the iron scent of blood, seemed to close in around the soldiers. The Americans had held their ground for hours against relentless fire, their movements precise, calculated, and desperate. Every man felt the weight of the day, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the ache of burns and bruises, the knowledge that one misstep could be fatal, And yet, amid this chaos, there was an unshakable sense of unity, a shared faith in each other and in the simple metal domes that crowned their heads. The Japanese assaults became increasingly aggressive, desperate to break the lines. Mortars rained down, trees splintered, and bullets tore through the dense undergrowth. A soldier ducked behind a fallen log, feeling the ground shake as a shell exploded nearby. A shard of metal glanced off the crown of his helmet, leaving a jagged dent. He froze for a heartbeat, heart pounding, then looked up in disbelief at what had just saved him from a fatal blow. Around him, the same scene repeated countless times. Soldiers who might have been lost were still standing, still fighting, still alive. Each dented helmet was a silent testament to lives spared. There was a moment, almost cinematic in its intensity, when the battalion found themselves pinned between two advancing forces. The Japanese soldiers, having recognized the Americans' resilience, attempted to crush them with coordinated fire. The Americans, battered and weary, responded with calculated discipline. The men moved as one, leveraging the protection of their helmets and the cover of the jungle. One by one, they pushed forward, refusing to yield, their trust in their gear and each other proving unshakable. In the midst of the chaos, officers on both sides took note. Japanese commanders, once dismissive and laughing at what they considered a trivial piece of equipment, now recorded the effects with sober acknowledgement. Reports described soldiers surviving direct hits that should have been fatal. Observers from both sides witnessed the same truth. The helmet was more than a tool, it was a guardian, a silent participant in the battle, transforming fear into courage, doubt into determination. Perhaps the most striking moments came when soldiers later recounted near misses. One young private, caught in an ambush, felt a heavy branch slam against his head. The metal of his helmet crumpled under the force, but he walked away, shaken but alive. Another soldier described a fragment of shrapnel tearing through the air above him, striking the top of his helmet with a metallic clang. The dent left in the steel was a permanent reminder of survival, a scar that told a story no photograph could capture. These were ordinary men, performing extraordinary feats, shielded by nothing more than carefully engineered steel. As the day drew to a close, the battalion had survived. Casualties had been minimized, morale had endured, and the men had proven, in the most visceral way imaginable, the value of foresight and preparation. The helmets, once the object of ridicule, were now revered. Soldiers ran their hands over the dents and scars, inspecting each mark as if reading a map of the battlefield itself. Every mark represented a story of survival, a life spared, and a quiet triumph over circumstances that might have otherwise been fatal. In the aftermath, the impact of the helmet extended far beyond the battlefield. Stories were told in letters home, in memoirs, and in reports that reached military leaders. Soldiers described the sense of security it provided, not just physically, but psychologically. They had faced one of the most dangerous jungles of the Pacific, endured artillery barrages and sniper fire, and emerged alive. And it was this helmet, seemingly simple and unremarkable at first glance, that had allowed them to do so. Historians would later reflect on this moment as a turning point, not in terms of strategy or victory, but in human ingenuity and its role in survival. The lesson was clear: even the smallest innovations, the simplest forms of foresight, could change the fate of an entire battalion. Engineers, designers, and soldiers alike understood that survival in war was as much about preparation as courage, as much about anticipating danger as confronting it. And in this case, a simple helmet had proven its worth beyond any expectation. The Japanese officers, who had laughed, who had mocked, carried their own lesson from this day. The battlefield had a way of exposing hubris, of humbling even the most disciplined and confident. They had underestimated the power of design, of innovation, and of human ingenuity. And in doing so, they had witnessed a quiet miracle, the survival of a battalion against odds that seemed insurmountable, saved by something they once dismissed as a trivial piece of metal. As the sun set over the jungle, casting long shadows over the scarred terrain, the soldiers adjusted their helmets one last time, wiping sweat and grime from their faces. Each man carried with him not just the memory of survival, but a deep respect for the innovation that had protected them. The helmet had become more than a tool, it had become a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, Human foresight, preparation, and ingenuity can create a difference between life and death. Years later, as veterans recounted these events, the story of the helmet became legend. It was a tale of courage, of resilience, and of the quiet, unassuming power of careful planning. And while battles would rage on and wars would come and go, the memory of that day, the echoes of laughter turned to awe, and the battered, dented helmets would endure as a testament to one undeniable truth. Sometimes, survival is not about bravery alone. It is about being prepared, even in ways others might not understand, and trusting in the tools and ingenuity that protect life when everything else is at stake. The story of the helmet, once laughed at, once dismissed, had forever changed the way soldiers approached battle, strategy, and survival. It stood as a quiet, indelible reminder that in war, the smallest innovations often have the greatest impact. And for the battalion that day, in the sweltering heat of the Pacific jungle, it had meant the difference between death and life, despair and hope, mockery and legend.